Hello. So this will be a technical presentation about Argo CD, and we're going to focus specifically on how to adopt Argo CD in an enterprise. So think many clusters, many applications, big teams. It's not just your typical home lab. So my name is Kostis. I'm working at Octopus Deploy as a developer advocate. Previously, I was working at Codefresh, and you might have seen my articles on the Codefresh blog. I'm actually a member of the Argo team, focusing on Argo CD and Argo rollouts, and I'm the co-author of the first ever GitOps certification that is available today at learning.octopus.com. So these are some of the topics that we will cover, and some of them maybe you have seen before, but some of them are brand new. Finalizers is my favorite one. I think that finalizers is a great topic, and there isn't enough content out there. So if you ever wondered what finalizers do in Argo CD and how to use them, stay until the end. So hopefully everybody will find something for themselves. So just to cover the basics and make sure that everybody's on the same page, let's cover the most popular Argo CD question ever. How do you install Argo CD? Okay. So if you're familiar with how Argo CD gets installed, essentially you have two choices. You can install Argo CD on each cluster. That's the setup on the right. Or you can have an Argo CD instance that is installed centrally, and then it's controlling other clusters. And I want to be super clear, this is an Argo CD instance controlling other Kubernetes clusters, not controlling other Argo CD instances. So this is a very popular question, and we have to cover this today because so many people are asking about this, especially when they start with Argo CD. And the answer is it depends. So we're not going to cover this today. We will need maybe 6 hours, but there is an article that we wrote. It's available on the Codefresh blog. You can see the QR code there, and it explains all the advantages and disadvantages for each way. And maybe you need to understand, what is best for your own company. Maybe in some company you need to do one, another company the other. So this is the answer to the question. Go and read it. But since you are here with me, I can also make a suggestion. I suggest you start with a centralized mode. So you install Argo CD on a central cluster. Here it's the admin cluster. And then you control other clusters. And this is my suggestion because there are several features of Argo CD, mainly application sets, that assume you have this centralized setup. So do this if you have, let's say, a small number of clusters. And you can see I'm showing here the typical trilogy of QA, staging, and production. That being said, maybe you are working a financial company or a company that has strict requirements and you need to follow some legislations. And maybe you have this requirement where production must be always different than non-production stuff. So in this case, and in this case only, you can modify the infrastructure and have two central Argo CD instances, one for handling all production clusters and one that is handling everything that is non-production. But that's it. Don't add 3 central instances or 4 instances for tooling and stuff like this. You will make your life more difficult. So now that I covered the most popular Argo CD question ever, let's start with a presentation of how you adopt Argo CD in the enterprise. And the first thing I'm going to talk about, essentially the points are according to the order I see them in companies, is to avoid dynamic applications. And by this, I mean that several companies do the mistake of adopting Argo CD, and instead of reevaluating their infrastructure or rethinking how the infrastructure works, they just take Argo CD and just put it in the existing stuff they already have without any extra thought. And this is almost always a mistake. So usually companies have some kind of a database or internal system or another application that is handling all the configuration of the applications. And then they think that Argo CD is just another standard application that because it has an API, you can call the API and do stuff. So they attach Argo CD to their existing infrastructure by simply taking the configuration from the internal system and then passing it to Argo CD. And if you are familiar with the GitOps principles, you should instantly understand that this is a mistake because nothing is saved anywhere. If you're not familiar with the GitOps principles, I'm not going to talk them about today. Go to opengitops.dev and look at them. We have so many presentations about the GitOps principles. You're falling into this trap if you're doing any of these. So here, this company has a custom CLI. This is my app CLI that you run it. It connects to this magic database, and then it takes all the information it needs and it passes it to Argo CD by using the Argo CD CLI, or you can use some fancy templating or bash scripts or whatever. Here in this example, I'm using env subst and a template, and then you pass this to kubectl apply. So these are not saved anywhere. You just created an application that is not saved anywhere in Git. So if this Argo CD instance goes down, you lost everything. You didn't lose like the application itself, but you lost the configuration of the application. And this is exactly what GitOps says that you shouldn't do. GitOps says that everything should be stored in Git, not only the applications themselves, but also the configuration. So if you work in a company and this is the official way to create Argo CD applications, you are doing it wrong. What you should do instead is to follow the GitOps principles. So Argo CD works with Git. So take your existing configuration from the system that you already have. It doesn't really matter which system is that and if it's internal or not. Use any custom CLI that you already have, but the end result should be committed in Git. So take the configuration, put it in Git, and then Argo CD takes over without any idea on how these files landed in Git. But the way of interaction with Argo CD should be Git, and we'll also see why this is important. If you see the arrow between Git and the Argo CD cluster, it's bi-directional, and we are going to talk about this. So this is how you adopt Argo CD. Save everything in Git, which is a good practice anyway. I mean, you shouldn't wait for Argo CD to understand this. So this covers the initial deployment of applications. Okay, that's great. But then how do you update applications? Again, I see some companies that make the first part correct, but miss completely the second part. So they deploy the application correctly, but then they use custom scripts or custom tools or Terraform or other kubectl commands, and they update the applications. Here I have two examples. Usually these commands are in a CI system like Jenkins or Circle CI or TeamCity. And again, this is wrong. This change is not saved anywhere. Like you do an upgrade with kubectl, and this change is not in Git anymore. If the Argo CD instance goes down, you lose this information because it wasn't stored anywhere. So keep in mind that you need to work with GitOps both for the initial installation of Argo CD, but also for the continuous upgrade of all the applications. And this brings me to the next point of essentially how you need to rethink the whole process. So before Argo CD, you have usually what is shown on the top here. You have a CI pipeline, let's say with Jenkins, and it's end-to-end. It starts from source code, it compiles the source code, it creates the image, maybe it's running unit test, integration test, it pushes the container image, and then almost always there is a custom step inside the CI system that is calling kubectl or a custom script, and then it changes the cluster. This step needs to go away because it does direct changes to the cluster that are not saved anywhere at all. You cannot audit these changes. You don't know when they happened. And if, as I said, the Argo CD instance, if your cluster goes down, you lose everything. So once you adopt Argo CD, you need to go on the setup on the bottom. The first part of the CI process stays exactly the same. Okay, your CI system still compiles code, runs integration tests, unit tests, security scans, but it stops when the container image is pushed. And then it's your responsibility, either with the CI system or a different system, or even with Octopus, to commit the manifests to Git, to update the images in Git, so that Argo CD can take over and can pull the changes from Git. So as far as Argo CD is concerned, it only looks at Git and makes changes to the cluster according to Git. There isn't any custom script that is making direct changes to the cluster. So yes, you can keep your CI process, but only one part of it, okay? Not the whole thing. Okay, so now you know how you install Argo CD, you know how to use Argo CD. How do you organize the Git repos that I'm talking about? This is also another big subject, and we could talk 5 hours about this. But I'm just going to cover here the basics. First of all, you need to split your Git repositories. The number one best practice for Argo CD is that you should keep your source code in one Git repo. This is what developers work on. This is what they continue to do their pull requests. But then you have a separate Git repo for all the Kubernetes manifests. This is the absolute minimum because each system has its own life cycle and its own needs. For very big installations, and we are going to see some examples, maybe you need to even further split the Kubernetes manifests between the manifests that are for the applications themselves. So deployments, ingress controllers, service and stuff like this, and then a separate Git repo for Argo CD manifests. So the applications and the application sets, depending on the size of your company. But the end result is that every Git repository should have like a different life cycle. So usually source code is changing all the time, like developers commit features and they want to send them to production very fast. Your customized and Helm files, they do not change that often, at least the basic changes. Maybe you change them every day or every hour, or then there is a new image. And your application sets should never change. Like you create them once and then that's it. So it doesn't really make sense to use the same Git repo to store things that have different life cycles. Use different Git repositories. Now, the next question is how many Git repositories you have. And here there is also a very big discussion. You will find lots of information on the internet. I'm going to give you here my personal opinion, which is create a Git repository per team or maybe per department, depending on the size of the company. This will also help developers, and we will see the interaction with developers later, that they want to check out something that is only related to them. They don't want to see the whole thing because maybe it's confusing or maybe they don't care about anything else. So create a Git repository per team, and also the infra team or DevOps team or whatever you call them, the operator team, they are a team on their own. So there is a Git repository that has applications like Core DNS, Nginx, Set Manager, like not the things that developers develop. So this is my recommendation, and this will help you avoid lots of bottlenecks that come if you try to use a single repository. Because this is what I see all the time. Companies adopt Argo CD, and for some reason, maybe because it's the path of least resistance, they have a single mono repo for everything because it makes things easy for operators, maybe not for developers. And this, if you're in a big company, will become the bottleneck. At some point in time, you will have issues either with Argo CD syncing or with Argo CD pooling changes from the Git repo. It will be a big problem. I'm not going to cover all the possible solutions there. There are a lot. There is a dedicated page that I have linked here for Argo CD that has a lot of points on how you can fine-tune this setup. A lot of people are missing the manifest generate path annotation, which instructs Argo CD to only look at the specific paths that the application depends on. My point from this slide is that if you want to do a monorepo, yes, it's possible, but do some research, understand what is going on, understand all the capabilities that Argo CD offers for this, because if you don't, you will have a bottleneck. And usually it's at this point when people come to us and say our big Argo CD installation is not working, and we ask them, are you using a monorepo? And they say yes, and we know what we will do. Okay, so now we talked about the Git repos. What do you actually put into these Git repos? And I will cover both Helm and Customize because I love both, but Helm is more popular. So let's start with this. I see a lot of companies that either try to learn Helm and Argo CD at the same time, or even worse, they think they know about Helm, but in reality they don't. And they try to solve the Helm problems with Argo CD, or they try to replicate Helm functionality with Argo CD. So if you're using Helm, I expect from you to know how Helm works on its own. Okay, this is super important. How Helm works on its own before Argo CD gets into the picture. So Helm on its own support Helm hierarchies. You can create a tree of Helm values, and these values can be ordered. The order is important, and the last one wins. Like if you have the same setting in all these three files, the one that is defined in the specific prod cluster YAML will take effect over everything that is above it. And if you use the Helm CLI, and notice I'm talking about the standard Helm CLI, okay? We're not talking about Argo CD just yet. You can put many values in the command line, and again, the last one wins. This is standard Helm functionality that you should know, okay? Because I see a lot of people who try to replicate this setup. So once you know how Helm works, go ahead and create all your Helm values for all your environments in a self-contained way, okay? Argo CD is not here just yet. There is nothing specific to Argo CD in these folders and in these directories. It is just Helm values, and they should be in the correct hierarchy where you have generic values for all environments, then maybe other values for specific regions or types of environments, and then special values for specific clusters. This should be in place before you adopt Argo CD. Once you adopt Argo CD, if you have this setup already, things are super easy and super clear. Argo CD essentially replicates what Helm already does. So here I have my Argo CD application, and you can see I have a list of value files, and Argo CD will treat them exactly the same way as standard Helm. It will process all of them, but the last one wins. So if there is a specific setting, value in specific prod cluster has the same name with everything else, it will take effect and everything above it will be ignored. So if you adopt Argo CD and you already have your Helm value files in place, everything is super easy. If you haven't understood how Helm works, you will try to replicate with Argo CD features that already work with Helm. And then you fall into the trap that you make life difficult for everybody, especially for developers. Like if you try to put Helm stuff into Argo CD files, you have now two sources of information. There is some part of the application lives in Helm values and some part of the application lives in Argo CD files. And especially developers will get confused right away because they will not understand how an application is deployed. They will not know where to look, and you will start a very difficult discussion with them. You will also force them to learn about Argo CD, and we will see why this is really, really bad. Ideally, if you have followed my advice and your Helm values are self-contained, developers essentially don't have to do anything with Argo CD. They can take any Helm chart plus the values and run it locally, which is the best possible scenario for developers. They don't need to install Argo CD. They don't need to know anything about Argo CD. They just run the application locally and it's self-contained and everything works as expected. So this is what we want to do with developers. If you want to know more about how to use Helm with Argo CD, because this is also a big topic, I have written a complete guide. You can see the blog post, and there is also a QR code, and you can see there also a starting Git repository that you can use for your own applications. I try to do this in most of my articles. There is the guide itself, and then there is also a Git repository that has a full example, so you can also try it by yourself. So this covers Helm, but I don't want to leave Customize fans sad. So let's talk about Customize as well. This is actually the one I prefer. Again, Customize is a tool that has lots of functionality on its own before you bring Argo CD into the mix. And apart from the overlays, everybody knows about Customize overlays. There are several other components and config map generators and transformers that offer lots more functionality to customize. And I find that a lot of people don't know anything about it. Like they come to us, they say we have a customized setup with Argo CD and it doesn't work. And I ask, okay, do you know anything about components? And they say, no, we don't. And this is actually my standard question. Like when somebody comes to me and says, we have the perfect setup with Customize and we are Customize experts and we know how Customize works, I ask them, do you know what is the difference between Customize, overlays, and components? And almost always people only know about overlays and they know nothing about components. Here I asked the LLM the same question, and I'm just pointing this to show you that it's not like a simple answer. You need to do some research and understand how Customize works and how to combine Customize components and Customize overlays before bringing Argo CD into the mix. This is also very easy to do let's say, self-test. If you truly understand Customize, go to the Customize documentation page and just tell me how many of the entries on the left you have actually read and understood. And a lot of people have never actually seen this list, or they have seen that just the basics, or they have read just overlays and namespace suffix, and that's it. So go and read the Customize documentation and understand all the capabilities that Customize offers, and then try to adopt Argo CD. Don't try to learn Customize and Argo CD at the same time. Same problem for Helm. Like if you try to split the information and you have some values in Customize overlays, some information in Customize overlays, and some information in Argo CD applications inside the Customize property, you will confuse developers. They will not know how an application is running. They will take the overlay and they will see that something is missing, and they will start asking questions. And you will say to them, oh, you also need to learn about how Argo CD and how Argo CD injects customized information into Argo CD applications. Don't do that. You make life for developers super difficult. If you want to know how to use customize with Argo CD, there is an article. Of course, here is the a link and the QR code. And like the previous one, there is a special, an associated Git repository that has a real example that you can use as a starting point for your own applications. So if you are using Helm, there is an example. If you're using Customize, there is an example. Everybody should be super happy. Now, we talked a lot about developers and when you make their life difficult. So I want to have a separate section for them. One thing I didn't mention in my introduction is that I was a developer before becoming a developer advocate. So I know the pain of developers when they try to work in a company and the system is working against them or it is making things difficult for them. So don't force developers to use Argo CD. So here I'm showing you the brain of a developer. This is the brain scan of a developer. I'm showing you what they have in their mind. And the bigger the box, the more important this thing is for developers. So as you can see, the bigger box is programming. This is the knowledge they need to write their favorite programming language, and they keep up with the new features of the programming language and how they use it. Then there is a smaller box, which is domain knowledge. So if they're working for a finance company, they need to know some financial stuff. If they're working for a medical company, they need to know some medical terms. It depends on the company they work for, and it's also a big box, like it's important on how they write code. Then Kubernetes is just a technical detail. It is just a deployment target, and they are not really interested about this. Before Kubernetes, it was VM. Maybe they also deploy stuff with functions or on-prem or whatever. Helm and Customize is an even smaller box. It's part of Kubernetes, so they don't really care about Helm and Customize. Maybe they will try to learn it if they need. And then Argo CD is this small box on the corner. So developers don't want to learn anything about Argo CD. Maybe Argo CD is interesting for you and important for you because, of course, it creates deployment process. But as far as developers are concerned, they don't care about Argo CD. And I have this in a separate slide on its own. Developers do not care about Argo CD manifest. They don't want to learn Argo CD. They're not interested in Argo CD. They don't care about how Argo CD works and how it injects customized information or Helm information manifest. This is not for them. So don't ask them to become Argo CD experts. If you look at the typical day of a developer or the typical session of a developer, and this is true, for any developers, most of their time is spent on their workstation creating a feature. Like they code. Yes, today they will use an LLM to create code. That's not really important, but they will create the feature locally on their workstation. And then at some point they will say, okay, I feel confident, and they will start testing it still locally. And when they are truly confident that something is ready, then they will push the code to a Git repo, and your deployment system will take over. So Argo CD or Octopus or something else. So this is the point that developers expect to interact with Argo CD if it is needed. Like when they need to commit and push something, they expect Argo CD to deploy the application to QA, and if things go well, take it to the next level. You can see that they do not expect to work with Argo CD locally. This is not something that they want. They need to spend 60% of the time in their workstation with just their favorite programming language in their IDE. And at some point at the end, maybe at the end of the day, when they push to a production, then they expect Argo CD to take over. And this is their time to interact with Argo CD. So if you force them to use Argo CD for local development, you make their life miserable. They don't want to learn Argo CD, they don't care about Argo CD, and they will not like to install Argo CD just for testing things locally. It's not something that they would like to do. And you can see if you are falling into this trap if a developer asks you, how do I run this application? And your first answer is, oh, you need to install Argo CD on your workstation, okay? If you do this, developers will get mad. They will not care about the rest of the answer. Because you have followed all the anti-patterns I explained before, like if you have some information in Argo CD manifest and not only Helm charts or customized overlays, developers need to work with Argo CD, and this is something that they hate. So if you find yourself that you have somewhere a wiki page where you explain to developers how they need to install Argo CD locally, you are doing it wrong. As we said before, if developers want to test something locally, they should be able to get only the Helm chart or only the customized overlays and components, run them locally without any knowledge of Argo CD. This is the ideal scenario, and this is how you can keep your developers happy. I'm also going to talk about the developer experience in general. Yes, you should also make a choice on how you approach developers, like as a whole strategy. So here you can see it's a spectrum. You can go one way or the other. So all the way to the right, you give them full access to Argo CD. They can do whatever they want. They can sync applications, delete applications. Then maybe in the middle, Argo CD is only available for debugging, or maybe it's read only. And then on the left, Argo CD is not available at all. Maybe you have a developer platform in front, like Backstage or Port, and they interact with that instead of Argo CD. Now, there isn't a correct or wrong answer here, but you need to decide what you want for developers and enforce it, okay? You need to make an informed decision, talk with the developers, of course, talk with your team leads, talk with everybody else. And if you insist and if you want, to give access to developers to Argo CD, you can do it. And here I'm saying that Argo CD already has the capability to be used with multi-user and multi-tenant scenarios. So there is a way where you can pull your users from SSO, you can define teams and then define specific applications and say this team of developers can access only these applications and they cannot access those applications. You can do it. I'm not going to explain today how you can do it, but know that this capability exists and it's very flexible. So here I have an example where I allow a developer to look at some Argo CD applications, but they are not allowed to do anything, not even sync, which is, let's say, a safe operation. So here a developer tried to sync an application that doesn't belong to their team, and they get an error message because I have not allowed this action for them. So you can do this. If you want to know how to enforce this, like the technical details, again, we have a guide. This is how to secure Argo CD with application projects and how RBAC works. This is the QR code and the URL. And again, there is a GitHub repo that you can use as a starting point. The last point regarding developers is grouping applications. So this is a big question that existed even before Kubernetes and even before Argo CD, especially if you're using microservices, how you group applications. So with Argo CD, you get so many more options. Maybe you had Helm umbrella charts already, but now you have Argo CD applications and application sets. Again, I cannot tell you this is the perfect thing for your company, but you need to sit down and talk with everybody and understand what are the possible choices and why. Because I see so many people that they come to us, they say they have an issue and they say, for example, they are using Helm umbrella charts. And I ask them, why did you use Helm umbrella charts and not application sets? And they just look at me like they said, we never understood that this was a real question. So here are some starting questions that you need to do with your team. And even though I'm spending 3 minutes on this topic in my presentation, maybe in your company, this topic is 2 hours or 2 days, depending on the size of your company. So bring all teams together, understand where are the applications deployed, how they are deployed, which applications are always deployed together, which applications are always upgraded together, which teams are controlling applications, and then make an informed decision on how you group those applications. Auto sync and self heal. It's a very important feature of Argo CD. For me, it's probably the main point why you're using Argo CD in the first place. So remember this picture I showed before where it's the before and after, like before you adopt Argo CD and after Argo CD. And some people might see the picture at the bottom and say, oh, this looks more complex. Like, why should they use Argo CD now with this more complex setup? And it's true that it's more complex because you get Argo CD in the mix, but you also have a unique advantage. With Argo CD, you avoid configuration drift completely. So configuration drift is an existing problem. It was true forever, even before Kubernetes, where you think you have some kind of configuration or values in a specific server, and in reality, you don't. So here I have a very simple example where you have 3 servers in the beginning. They are all the same, but then a cowboy developer does, let's say, temporary change in the second server. And then once you deploy, your deployment fails and you start to wonder why has deployment failed. And then after a discussion and evaluation, you see that this server is different than the rest. So this is why your deployment failed. So this was true even before Kubernetes, and it's true today with Kubernetes. And today, cowboy developers or cowboy operators use kubectl. You can use kubectl and do manual changes to a cluster that are not saved anywhere at all. So maybe you have a developer that does a temporary change in QA, or even worse, a temporary change in production, and this is not saved anywhere. And especially if you're working with a company that has, strict legislations, this is a big problem. So that's the problem. And once you adopt Argo CD, you completely eliminate this problem. So remember I talked about before that the arrow between Argo CD and Git has two arrows, like it is pointing both ways. It is bi-directional. So Argo CD not only monitors Git repos and applies changes to the cluster, but it also does the opposite. It monitors the cluster and notifies you when something has changed. So here a Cowboy developer did a manual change in the cluster, and Argo CD understood this, and it said to me, look, your application is healthy, but it's out of sync. Like things are okay now, but what you have in Git is not the same that you have in the cluster. So I can click on my application and right away in 3 seconds understand what is different. So here the developer added this, and now that I know this information, I can go and talk to the developer and ask them, hey, why do you need this? Should we commit it? Should we not commit it? But it's also easy to discard it completely. Like I can set up Argo CD to discard any manual changes. So this is what you get compared to traditional pipelines. Like a Jenkins pipeline only knows what is happening while the pipeline is running. It doesn't know anything after 5 minutes that the pipeline has finished. So if you adopt Argo CD, make sure to enable always auto-sync and self-heal. Auto-sync means one direction of the arrow. Self-heal means the other direction of the arrow. It will monitor the cluster, and also it will discard any changes that are found in the cluster. And please enable this in production. Production is exactly the place where you want to avoid configuration drift and don't have any issues. Sync phases and sync waves is another popular subject that I'm going to cover a bit here. It's how you order your resources once you deploy them. So if you don't define any waves or phases, Argo CD will just do the default, and the default is the same as the Helm default ordering. It will follow a predefined order, but maybe in your application, you need to select a different order of resources, and you can do this with Cook and sync waves. And my point here is go and read the Argo CD documentation. I know it sounds basic, but lots of people do not do this. This is actually a diagram we added recently in the official Argo CD documentation, which is groundbreaking for several people, that explains what you get out of the box with Argo CD. So you can see here you have the main sync process, you have things before the sync process, after the sync process, and also if things fail, you can do some cleanups. So notice the phases, notice also the arrows. So you can call a cleanup job in sync fail if something failed in the sync phase. But if, let's say, something fails in post sync, you can see there is no arrow that connects post sync to fail. You cannot run a cleanup job if post sync fails. So understand this. And if you try to use waves, which is a way of numbering your resources according to the order that you want, understand that waves are scoped. This is an important point that a lot of people are missing or are getting confused. Waves are scoped per phase. So this -2 in the first phase is completely different than this -2 in the second phase, which is completely different than this -20 in the last phase. Understand how you can use them together. This is also my suggestion, to use only sync waves. If you don't want to have a problem with scopes, just have a flat list of sync waves and order your resources as you want. This is my suggestion. If you want to do more advanced stuff, like if you want before a deployment to notify Grafana, send a message to Slack, have an if statement that if something fails, do something else. And then after that deployment, run some smoke tests, and if they fail, do something. Then you don't need to abuse Argo CD. There is another project called Argo Workflows, which is also from the Argo family, and it's created for exactly this kind of scenario. So go and understand what Argo Workflows offers in addition to Argo CD, and understand how you can use those two projects together. If you try to model complex workflows with Argo CD sync phases, you will fail, and usually this is when you come to us. Here are some example questions I see people are asking, where I understand that essentially either they have not used workflows, or they are trying to abuse sync waves for things that were never meant to. Okay, so don't fall into these traps. If into this trap, if you find you're asking these questions, please check Argo Workflows. And last but not least, finalizers, one of my favorite topics. Okay, this is the final point. If you are working with Argo CD, you should know that essentially at any point in time, you have 4 points of resources or information. So first of all, you have your Helm or customized files in Git that define your application. This is shown at the bottom right. Then you have your Argo CD manifests in Git. These are your application sets and applications, and they are shown on the bottom left. So this is what exists in Git. And once you deploy to Argo CD applications are becoming resources on the cluster. This is what is shown on the top left. And then these reference specific resources that are deployed, which is what you care about on the top right. So these are the 4 sources of information. And if you remember the discussion about configuration drift, Argo CD guarantees that always what you have in the bottom is the same thing that you have in the top, and vice versa. This is just the standard Argo CD installation. What most people don't know is that you can play with finalizers and have orphan resources, like have Kubernetes resources that are no longer controlled by Argo CD. This is possible, and it's sometimes, and we will see some examples, it's also desirable. So you can have only the right part of this picture. Or you can have this. You can have Argo CD resources that are not controlling any Kubernetes applications, and sometimes this is also desirable. So understand that this, happy path scenario sometimes exists only at 50% of capacity. So you control this right and left part of the diagram with finalizers. Argo CD finalizers are an implementation of Kubernetes finalizers specifically for Argo CD, where you can instruct Argo CD to not delete Kubernetes resources when an Argo CD application is deployed. So I'm going to talk about 2 specific use cases. One is when you want to migrate applications from one Argo CD instance to the next, or once you have a single Argo CD instance and you want to upgrade it in place without any downtime. So this is my starting point. I have an Argo CD instance. It's controlling my Kubernetes applications. They are referencing Helm and customized files. Everything works great. The application is up. The application is healthy. Customers are happy. So I launched a second Argo CD instance. And for a brief, let's say, period of time, I also pointed to the exact same Kubernetes manifest. This is possible. This is not something that you should do, all the time, but you can do it as a temporary measure. So for a brief moment in time, I have 2 Argo CD instances controlling the same applications. And why do I want to do this? Because this is my time where I check Argo CD. I see that everything is fine. It's healthy. It's